Okay. Okay, welcome to this 1-hour webinar on self-neglect. My name is Michele Winter and I'm an independent social worker and trainer, mostly around safeguarding adults. And I also do safeguarding adult reviews now, which is like, well, the equivalent of a serious case review. And the idea today is to provide a generic introduction to self-neglect. So before we start, just going to take us through our aims and objectives. So just to say that some of you today might be aware of someone who self-neglects or hoards personally or professionally. So please take care of yourself, as this session could be triggering for you. And also just to say, this is a taster session. It's a bite-sized webinar. It's a complicated topic, and sometimes there's no easy answer. There's no right and there's no wrong. So this is a taster session. There are resources at the end to take your learning forward, including the updated self-neglect policy that was updated in June of this year, and there's also links to extra resources such as risk assessment tools, one of which I'm going to show you today, templates and all sorts of other things. I'd advise you to pop your questions in the chat function and they'll be monitored, and then once we stop recording at the end of the session, I'll look at those questions privately. So the session today is being recorded, so if you could be on mute please and shut your camera function down, that will be really helpful. Okay, so these are the aims and objectives for the session. We're going to chunk it up. We're going to look at what is self-neglect and who does it affect. We're going to look at ways we might recognise self-neglect and what the impact might be. Also causes of self-neglect, possible causes, and ways of working with people who self-neglect, including that Bristol-based policy and procedures and some further resources, as I've said. So, what is self-neglect then, and who does it affect? We're going to start with our definition of self-neglect that's in the Bristol policy. And this is one definition that is used across the land now, used across England by local authorities. And it says that self-neglect is defined as the inability, whether that's intentional or non-intentional, to maintain a socially and culturally accepted standard of self-care with the potential for serious consequences to the health and well-being of the self-neglectors and perhaps even to their community. So there's a long definition. I think that's just one sentence there, and there are lots of elements in it that we're going to unpick a little bit now and a little bit later. So we're going to do intentional and non-intentional in a moment, but we're going to start with some of the elements within this definition. So serious consequences is mentioned, and this helps us decide the appropriate level of response. So is it nobody's business? Is it the business of adult social care, so the local authority, because the person has got care and support needs? Is it something that actually needs a higher level response, for example, a safeguarding adults response, because it's very high risk, perhaps life-threatening to the person themselves or others? I've got a couple of slides later on safeguarding adults and safeguarding children. And the policy that I've mentioned covers off, you know, all that sliding scale. Is it the local authority's business? Is it safeguarding? The definition also talks about serious consequences to the health and the well-being of self-neglectors, so rather than just their health. So of course we do need to be mindful of a person's health. Is extremely important to pay attention to that, but also to see the person in the round, so holistically, and be mindful of their well-being. And this definition certainly helps us do that. So although it's taken from the Journal of Nurse Practitioners, it's not a simple medical model, it's a holistic model. This definition also talks about socially and culturally accepted standards of care. It's not saying we're measuring people against standards that are not culturally sensitive. It's not saying that at all. It's just making it clear that we're talking about the here and the now. So 2021, not 1940. England, not another country. So, for example, someone who lived through World War II and experienced severe deprivation that was socially and culturally accepted at the time because the country was at war. So there was a food shortage and there was needful rationing around food. That wouldn't be accepted as an accepted standard of living now in 2021. So that's what it means. The definition talks of serious consequences to the community as well. And this fits with us also needing to think about risk to others, as well as risk to the person who's self-neglecting. So, for example, someone who hoards and their stockpile is impacting adversely on neighbours because it's attracting rats, or it's a fire hazard, or that affects the family that lives with them, as there's a risk of falls, perhaps because there's trip hazards around, or there's a risk of things like piles of books and newspapers falling on somebody else. So that might be a risk to a carer, whether that's a paid carer or whether that's a worker that needs access. And we're going to unpick other elements of the definitions we go through, the intentional and non-intentional bit. But for now, it's important to note, as I've said, that this is the definition that's used within Bristol City Council's self-neglect policy. It's used alongside the self-neglect definition that's in the Care Act that relates to safeguarding. This expands on that, so it's really useful to us. Okay. So I wanted to talk about hoarding. I've mentioned it already. It's important to note that hoarding can be part of someone's self-neglecting behaviour, or it can be a form of self-neglect in its own right. Some people who hoard, not all of them, but some of them, can be assessed and deemed to have a hoarding disorder. And this first appeared in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM version 5, a few years ago now, and it's characterised by excessive acquisition or excessive saving of things, difficulty discarding things, and usually disorganisation. So it's different to obsessive compulsive disorder, which can have an element of hoarding, but might, for example, be where the excessive acquisition is catalogued, or organised in some way. So both might need support through mental health services, but treatment plans are going to be very slightly different depending on, the diagnosis. So hoarding facts and figures, we know that studies have consistently, so I've got studies here from 2008, 2011, and right up to date this year from Mind. These studies have consistently highlighted that people with hoarding tendencies have a threefold chance of being overweight or obese. They're more likely to have a spectrum of chronic and severe physical medical concerns. And they've used mental health services 5 times as much as the general population. So there's lots of layers of vulnerability there. In terms of prevalence, prevalence is 5% in the US, 1.5% in the UK, and 4.6% in Germany. And if we think about this, if we think about the US and the UK, for example, we know that a lot of things in the US go large. You go to McDonald's, it's go large, and that's part of that culture has come over to this country. But we're still, relatively speaking, have a lot less hoarders than in the US. We know that somebody who's got a hoarding disorder they're twice as likely to be a man than a woman. They're nearly 3 times as common in people aged 55 and older, but there is an early onset, and that's most common. So later onset is less common. So what we know is that although early onset, say in the teens, is most common, it might often be trauma-based. It's usually not seen as a problem or not picked up upon until later in life. So when somebody starts accessing services, maybe because of mental health issues in adulthood, or because of health issues in adulthood, or care and support needs, or housing issues. So things become apparent to us for people who hoard later in life. At that younger age, it's seen as collecting. Whereas over a longer period of time, the collecting becomes clutter. which becomes a hoard, maybe because there's more time to accumulate, there's maybe more money to accumulate, there's more space to hoard that accumulation as the person moves into their own accommodation, for example. And we need to think about how society helps us hoard with things like buy one, get one free. How supermarkets even arrange their wares to tempt us down aisles that we haven't even gone into. So, those clothes that are in supermarkets now with the offers and the sales, the smells they use to tempt us down certain aisles. How we're encouraged to go paperless, for example. So the shop says, can I have your email so I can send the receipt to you? And then, of course, once they've got your email address, they will bombard you with those special offers. So you're trying to entice you to buy more and more. And that can really feed into people with hoarding disorders or hoarding tendencies. So how do we recognise self-neglect? What might the indicators be? So in the definition, we had intentional and non-intentional self-neglect mentioned. So intentional self-neglect is active. That can be a conscious choice to engage in self-neglect. So that might be where someone is refusing services, or they're withdrawing permission for access for carers to come in. They're rejecting support. Non-intentional is passive self-neglect, and that might be the result of health-related conditions that contribute to the risk of developing self-neglect. So, for example, someone with dementia might forget their medication, they might forget to eat. Someone who's depressed might not have the motivation to help them get up, washed and dressed. Someone with a physical impairment or ill health might not be able to care for their environment like they used to be able to. So it's useful for you when you're working with someone to unpick, are there elements that are intentional? Are there elements that are non-intentional? Because you're going to need a different approach with the different elements. So self-neglect can include lack of self-care, so neglect of personal hygiene, neglect of your nutrition, hydration, and or health. So if we think about nutrition, hydration, that's really important, for example, around our elderly population. If they don't keep themselves hydrated and nourished, they go downhill really quickly. And the same thing about, the domestic environment. If they're not putting the heating on, they can get hypothermia really quickly. They can overheat really quickly. So lack of self-care, lack of care of the domestic environment. So maybe things are broken. Maybe the cooker doesn't work anymore, the heater doesn't work anymore. Maybe there's a lot of clutter. Maybe it's got a bit squalid, there's rats. There's a cat been in the house, or whatever it might be. There's the refusal of care or services, and if they accepted those, they would mitigate the risk to safety and well-being. They would lower that risk. So if someone's accepting care, if someone's engaging with services, then they're not at that higher risk where they're refusing and we can't get in to work with them. So it's important to note that poor environments and personal hygiene might be a matter of personal or lifestyle choice, or other issues such as insufficient income. So again, it's worth thinking about, is this intentional or unintentional? Could we get a grant sorted out so we can get some repairs done? Is it that actually when they were young, they had a bath once a week and a strip wash every night, and that's okay? So we're unpicking, again, is it intentional, is it unintentional? What's the context for this behaviour? And we need to think about what the indicators of self-neglect might be. So they could be living in very unclean, as I say, sometimes verminous circumstances. The poor care leads to that decline in personal hygiene. There's an issue around healing of sores, pressure sores not healing because they're not being kept clean, they're not being dressed regularly, poorly maintained clothing. This creates a system where they're isolated from their community. Maybe they're embarrassed to bring someone back. Failure to take medication, which can lead to health issues. The hoarding issues we've talked about, and household maintenance, as I've said. So the impact of self-neglect and hoarding is all sorts of different things. There could be an escalation of mental ill health, social isolation, emotional well-being issues, physical health issues, strained relationships with all sorts of people, including landlords. So is their tenancy at risk? Are there issues at work? Because actually they're going to work a bit dishevelled, a bit smelly. Are there issues around money because they're getting into debt because they're spending so much? You know, relationships get impacted. Ultimately, the impact of ultimately can be seen as death. So, for example, 2 to 5% of properties in the UK are classified as having a hoarding problem, but they account disproportionately for fire fatalities. 25 to 30% of properties that have hoarding issues, 25 to 30% of fire fatalities are from properties where there's a hoarding issue. So the ultimate impact of self-neglect can be death. If someone isn't taking their medication for diabetes, if an elderly person isn't keeping hydrated or eating properly, for example, getting too hot, too cold, their mental health deteriorates and escalates because they're not taking their medication. Their pressure sores become deep and you can see through to the bone and the muscle. I've mentioned elderly people a couple of times here, and of course self-neglect goes across the lifespan, across the life course. However, it's more likely to become to be life-threatening when someone's older due to particular health issues that affect us more and more as we get older, like heart disease, you know, kidney disease, dementia. So as stated earlier, this could be deliberate, it could be unintentional, and it's useful to find out which, or is it a bit of both, and which element is which, because that informs an appropriate response. So if it's about forgetting to take medication, things can be put in place to prompt that person to take medication. Where if it's deliberately not taking the medication, is that because the person doesn't like the side effects from the medication? So maybe could there be a change in the medication to help with that? Or is it about actually actively trying to harm themselves? With self-neglect, there can be a vicious cycle. The more a person self-neglects or hoards, the more socially isolated they can become. And that feeds into the underlying issues that cause or trigger the self-neglect in the first place. So there's a need to interrupt that cycle and work on root causes. So what might be the causes of self-neglect? This slide quotes from real people from a thematic review that Michael Preston Shute did a few years ago. And quotes like these, hearing from people themselves, can really help us in our understanding and provide insight into people's real lived experiences and possible reasoning around their behaviour. For example, maybe they are more back in the 1940s than the here and now due to their dementia, and they're just doing what Mr. Churchill told them to, make do, amend. Maybe there's someone who was in care as a child and they were moved around a lot, and so they lost their possessions, or they didn't have many, and now they cling on to those possessions. Maybe they're making excuses about the size of their property. Actually, in fact, they would fill any space available to them. So it's really important to hear these voices, and research such as Michael Preston Shute does, research in practice, does, can really help get us to those voices. And of course, you listening to your service users, your clients' voices, you know, what's their history, what's their context, what's their explanation, have they got one for why, you know, they are hoarding or self-neglecting? So possible causative factors. It's really important not to see self-neglect as a lifestyle choice. It's a complex mix of personal, mental, physical, social, health, environmental, and historical factors. And as we saw that from those voices, from those people's voices, lots of different factors contributing, including but not limited to this list here. So maybe it is that disturbance in their physical health. You know, they can't get their arm round anymore to wipe their bottom, to wash their back, to wash their hair. Maybe there's an escalation in their mental health. Maybe they're depressed. Maybe they've internalized feelings of not deserving any better. Maybe it's about pride. Maybe it's about fear. You know, they're scared of social services, the local authority, because they can remember way back when there were things like workhouses, you know, and they associate that with social services, and they're going to be taken away and put in a care home. Maybe they're not wanted to conform to social norms. Maybe it's a response to past losses, abuse, or trauma. We're going to look at that. A coping mechanism that serves a useful purpose. Maybe they've lost links with family. Family have moved away, become displaced, so there's nobody to help them anymore. Maybe there's financial issues. Maybe there were links to self-harm. So any or all of these might be relevant to each person you're working with. If we're working with someone, we need to give them time and patience and consistency in relationship-based work so that we can build trust and tease out the contributing factors. A light touch approach, a let's get this sorted approach, is not going to work. We'll move on to what does work a bit later. Firstly, it's important to recognise that self-harming behaviours can lead to self-neglect and vice versa, but there is a difference between self-harm and self-neglect. Self-neglect can be a sign or a symptom of another type of abuse taken. So if I'm a bit smelly, they won't want to touch me. Or it could be that past sexual abuse leads to an elderly person refusing personal care. Okay, so we're going to focus a little bit now on self-harm versus self-neglect. This is something that comes up a lot when I train on this topic. So self-harm and self-neglect are not the same thing. They need different approaches in order to best meet needs. And we need to bear in mind the principles of the Mental Capacity Act and Safeguarding Adults principles in categories. And self-neglect is a category. So what is self-harm then? We've looked at what self-neglect is. What is self-harm? According to Mind, self-harm is when you hurt yourself as a way of dealing with very difficult feelings, old memories, or overwhelming situations and experiences. The National Self-Harm Network has a similar definition, stating that self-harm is primarily a coping strategy and can provide a release from emotional distress and enable an individual to regain feelings of control. And the NHS says that self-harm is when somebody intentionally damages or injures their body. It's usually a way of coping with or expressing overwhelming emotional distress. So while self-harm and self-neglect can overlap, like in that Venn diagram there, and they can lead into each other, it's still useful to unpick and differentiate between the two within a situation so that neither element gets overlooked and approaches can be tailored to the different needs of each element. For example, self-harm in the form of suicide, attempts to take your own life or threats to do so is not self-neglect, that is self-harm. That type of behaviour might need a crisis intervention through the police, through the ambulance service, or the mental health crisis team. Self-harming with drug and/or alcohol needs a specialist approach that depends on engagement and motivation to change, and that might include a residential or a community rehabilitation service. Self-harming around food, such as various eating disorders, that's high risk, might need a Mental Health Act intervention. All of those might also need a safeguarding response if those self-harming behaviours have led to high risk of self-neglect and the person has got care and support needs and they're unable to protect themselves by changing their behaviour, engaging with services that can help lower the risk to the self-neglect element. Therefore, any resulting plan for the people you work with at any level of response might incorporate specialist self-harm intervention as well as utilisation of that self-neglect policy I mentioned earlier, and that there's a link to it as well later on. Okay. So I wanted to do just a brief exercise with you, because I don't have a lot of time today, but just a brief bit of exercise with you around hoarding. So trust me, I'm a socialite. So close your eyes for just a moment and focus on an object that is dear to you. Really visualize that object and think about why it means so much to you. What's its history? You know, where does it come from? When did you get it? Who gave it to you? So all those associations to this precious object that you are closing your eyes and visualizing. Think about those feelings. Why is it so precious to you? What about the people associated with it and the memories attached to it? You can open your eyes if you close them. I want you now to imagine how you might think, how you might feel, and what you might then do if someone was to try to take that object away from you. So, for example, you might think, who does she think she is, that Michele Winter? She's got no right to take this or even suggest that it goes in the bin. She's being judgmental. She doesn't understand how important this is to me. You might therefore feel angry, you might feel upset, you might feel scared, you might feel let down, you might feel really anxious. And then you might refuse to see Michele Winter because she's going to take it away. You might shout at her, you might cry, you might become withdrawn, your mental well-being might be affected. You might disengage with that person trying to take the object. So all of those things that you might think, feel and do in relation to your precious object are similar to how someone with an issue around hoarding thinks, feels and might do. If you come in, or any professional comes in and tells them to clear up, to throw things away, this is rubbish, they're as attached to what you might describe as rubbish or clutter or waste as you are to that object you've just visualized. And if you understand that, and if you can put yourself in their shoes around their feelings, you can develop some empathy, and you can work from a place of empathy rather than judgment. Think about it. Okay, so we're going to look at some models of understanding, and these models also help us think about possible intervention that we might be able to do, or we might need to enable someone to engage with somebody else who might be able to do this. These models can help understand why someone might be self-neglecting and or hoarding, and think about our own skills, our qualifications. Are we the best person here to do elements of it, or as I say, to refer on? So we're going to start with the cognitive behavioural model. So here, emotions are like an addiction and they're hard to control. Society and culture feeds into that. For example, the need to feed that emotion comes with accumulation. So the buy one, get one free, the recycling, landfill concerns, all of that stuff feeds into the emotions. With this model, there's a recognition that there is a difficulty in cognitive processing around things like information processing. So, for example, information processing around memory. So if something's put away, tidied away, it's forgotten. So keeping it out and in sight really helps that person become less anxious. So the emotions of anxiety and worry, they don't need to remember where it is because they can see it. There might be difficulty in information processing around categorization. For example, the person can't make distinctions. Everything is individual, everything's needed, and therefore I need to keep everything. Nothing can be thrown away because they can't distinguish between something that's useful, something that's rubbish, something that's broken. So the information processing, there's an issue around it. There might be difficulty around information processing around attention. So difficulty in keeping focused, in keeping to task around tidying up, around sorting, around cleaning. So this model recognises when people might want to change, but actually they can't due to those cognitive difficulties in information processing. And that understanding is important in terms of interventions. For example, leaving someone on their own to just get on with it won't work. They need help to get motivated, to keep motivated, to distinguish, to sort, to remember where things are. There were also issues this model deals with around beliefs that might be developed. For example, beliefs and feelings around anticipated loss, around risks, around loss of control if they let go of some of those objects. So an intervention might look at gently challenging some of those beliefs. Emotions might have become entrenched and confused. So positive emotions that a person feels when acquiring a new object needs to be replaced by something else if acquisition is agreed to be limited. Okay, so care also needs to be taken around the feelings of loss when letting objects go. So looking after somebody when they are clearing out and letting objects go. Psychodynamic approach. This model delves deeper and looks at negative or traumatic experiences throughout life, including in childhood. So including around loss, around shame, around anxiety. And loss and trauma can be early, so what we call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, but they can also be across the lifespan, the life course, and so they can be accumulative, layer upon layer, so adding complexity. The hoard becomes a cocoon and represents safety. So people have spoken of surrounding themselves with things as a way of hiding, as a way of feeling safe. And again, that could have started in childhood. The person projects themselves into things. So disgusted reactions to the hoard are felt as a disgusted reaction to the person themselves. It's felt as a personal attack by that person making that judgment against them as someone who's a self-neglector, who's someone who's a hoarder. Throwing things away becomes like throwing part of yourself away, makes it really hard. And that's why people retrieve. So they might be able to throw things away or declutter, and then they go and retrieve or rebuy things. Things, so their collection, their hoard, compensate for rejection or loss. It fills that emotional void, that void. It's important to note, therefore, that enforced clear-outs, deep cleans, can re-traumatise someone. They can trigger those deep emotions. And so alongside any programme of decluttering for someone who is traumatised, there needs to sit some sort of therapeutic engagement. That might be group, it might be one-to-one counselling. You can't just do a deep clean and not expect to re-traumatise someone. And then we've got the medical model. So there is often a heritability factor. Is this about upbringing? So is it learnt behaviour? Or, is it genetics? So hoarding tendencies are passed down the genes, for example. Or is it both? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it a combination? Plus linked to those societal issues earlier that push us to go large, that push us to buy one, get one free, etc., etc. There can also be common medical or mental health conditions that include obsessive compulsive disorder, as I've mentioned, acquired brain injury, which of course impacts as well on information processing. People who are on the autistic spectrum disorder are more likely to have hoarding issues, dementia, depression. So hoarding can be seen as a byproduct of these medical issues or mental health issues. So summarising this, we're needing to think about root cause. Models need to be tailored to individuals, as does any intervention. And there might need to be a combination of approaches, which makes it person-centred, rather than fitting a person to one of these models who might take elements out of it. So ways of working with people who self-neglect we're going to look at now, including I'm going to make reference to the Bristol-based policy and procedures. And we're going to start off with some ethical dilemmas. So this diagram shows us that there are ends of the spectrum and a continuum. Respect for autonomy and self-determination, so very much a hands-off approach. I hear still, well, they've got capacity, there's nothing we can do. Very hands-off, almost gatekeeping, prioritizing self-determination, seeing hoarding as a lifestyle choice. On the other end of the spectrum, that duty to protect and promote dignity. and that duty of care to protect from harm. So seeing harm as a risk, and extremes there is that deep clean, you know, that clear out, which actually re-traumatizes. And maybe we need to be somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. One can be very oppressive, one can be very dismissive, interfering too much and interfering with their human rights, or too little as a way of gatekeeping. So we need to come to a place that's somewhere in the middle and tries to balance this. As Lord Justice Mumby said a few years ago now, what good is it making someone safer if it merely makes them miserable? None at all. So do we need to get rid of all of that hoard, or can we just get it down to a level where the person can move freely through the house with no risk of falls, no risk of things toppling on them, no fire hazards? It's all about proportionality. It's finding a balance between those competing rights and duties, not wrapping someone up in so much cotton wool that they choke, not reducing their possessions down to nothing so they can't relate to their property, to their home anymore. Remember to empathise. What would you think? What would you feel? And what would you do if you were treated how you're planning to treat the person you're working with? And bearing that in mind, here are some of the laws which can help or hinder depending on how they are used. So they're not all the laws, just some of them, and not all elements of all of them. We've got the Public Health Act of 1934. Sections 31 to 32 in this act gives the local authority environmental health powers to clean and disinfect premises, but only for the prevention of infectious diseases. We've got the Housing Act of 1988. It states that a landlord may have grounds to evict a tenant due to breaches of the tenancy agreement. We've got the Human Rights Act of 1998. And there are a couple of articles under this act that might relate to self-neglect and or to hoarding. So Article 2, for example, is about right to life. So if we've got someone who's their self-neglect is life-threatening to themselves and or others due to it being a fire risk, we might need to invoke Article 2 of the Human Rights Act. We've of course got Article 8 as well, which gives us all a right to respect for private and family life. So that tells us to back off a bit and not interfere too much. However, it's not an absolute right, and there may be justification to override it. For example, the protection of health, prevention of a crime, protection of the rights and freedoms of others. So in that way, Article 2 can override, it can trump Article 8. We've got the Mental Capacity Act, and the Court of Protection has the power to make an order regarding a decision on behalf of an individual. The court's decision about the welfare of an individual who is self-neglecting might include, for example, allowing access in order to assess capacity when someone's refusing access. We've got the Animal Welfare Act. Sometimes people hoard animals, or sometimes a person's just unable to care or continue to care for a pet, so they end up neglecting it. It is unlawful to be cruel to an animal, including by neglecting them. An owner must ensure the needs of their animals are met. Education for the owner is the preferred option initially. There's an improvement notice that can be issued and monitored, and if it's not complied with, the result can be a fine or imprisonment. We've got the Mental Health Act. This act in 2007 amended the 2003 version and added to it. Section 135, Magistrates Court can authorise entry to a person's home if they're believed to have a mental disorder and they're living alone and unable to care for themselves. The order is for entry to remove them to a place of safety. And we've got the Care Act of 2014, which provides statutory guidance around all sorts of things, including safeguarding adults. For example, it places self-neglect as one of the categories of abuse when we're working with adults. There's 10 categories, and it introduced for the first time the category of abuse as self-neglect, which is different to neglect and acts of omission from somebody else. Talking about the Care Act, here are Care Act routes for people who are hoarding and or self-neglecting. So you've got people down the bottom of the triangle who are doing all right, and most people are doing all right most of the time. And as you go up the triangle, there are less and less people in it. And there's a massive gap between people doing okay and when the local authorities' duties kick in. Local authorities' duties come in two places in the Care Act when we're talking about self-neglect and or hoarding. So they have a specific duties around assessment, which is section 9 of the Care Act. They must undertake a needs assessment, even when the adult refuses, where it appears that the adult might have needs for care and support and they're self-neglecting. And then additionally, as I've said, self-neglect is included as a category of abuse under adult safeguarding, and therefore the local authority has a duty under section 42 of the Act to make inquiries or cause others to make inquiries if an adult has care and support needs, if they're self-neglecting, and if they're unable to protect themselves from the self-neglect because of their care and support needs. So in summary, those are the two levels of response from the local authority if someone's self-neglecting or hoarding. The highest level is safeguarding, high-risk cases. So think life-threatening to self and or others. The lower level, someone who is, for example, engaging and they have additional daily living needs. But it just isn't just up to the local authority to respond and work with people who self-neglect and hoard. If someone doesn't have care and support needs, the local authority has no responsibility, but you might. So for details on roles and responsibilities, see the Bristol Self-Neglect Policy. It's a really, really useful tool. And then to lay down all sorts of information in there around roles and responsibilities and tools. There's a risk assessment tool. There's a tool on how to conduct a multi-agency meeting, for example. And also we must think of not just the person who's self-neglecting, but what about others who might be affected? So the person they care for might be affected by their hoard, by their self-neglect, or it might affect any children that visit the house or live within the house. So as I've mentioned, safeguarding adults already. Is the person who's self-neglecting and or hoarding vulnerable in any way? Do they need some help with daily living? If so, you're making that referral to safeguarding adults, and there's a link to the referral form there. If you've got children who are self-neglecting or young people under 18 who are self-neglecting, is it a safeguarding or child protection matter for children's services? Is the person self-neglecting or hoarding responsible for a child or person? Is that child or young person under 18 being significantly harmed by any of that self-neglect or hoarding, or do they need some extra help as a family? If so, again, you're making a referral, but to children's services, and there's a link there. So helpful approaches to intervention. Bristol, we know, has done lots of work to become an ACE-aware city, and there are lots of resources on the Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership website. ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences, I mentioned them earlier, but we do need to think further than just being ACE-aware. We need to think about the people we work with who might have experienced ACEs, and they might experience multiple trauma through their life course. For example, that person who's living in a dirty home, who looks dishevelled and smells of urine, or who annoys their neighbours because their collections have spilled out into communal areas. Have they experienced multiple traumas? Is the way we treat them adding to that or helping with that? Are we seeing their manifestation of trauma as a lifestyle choice and dismissing it? Or do we try and hear their story and help them achieve positive, long-lasting change by enabling them to address root causes rather than just sticking a plaster on it, clearing it out of sight and hoping it doesn't escalate again? So knowing the law I've mentioned is useful. Knowing various agencies' responsibilities is useful. Knowing models to help our understanding, like I've explained, is helpful. And developing empathy, like with the Think, Feel, Do exercise, is crucial. Exploring approaches that are helpful, respectful, and least intrusive is all of our responsibility, whatever our role. So the next section is looking at some approaches that can help us when we're working with someone who self-neglects without re-traumatizing them. So best practice around self-neglect is all about these 3 stages: knowing, being, doing. So knowing is about knowing the individual, their unique history, and the significance of their self-neglect. That complements, obviously, professional knowledge and resources that we bring to our work. Being, such understanding is of being personal, demonstrating professional qualities of respect, empathy, honesty, patience, reliability, and care. The ability to be present alongside the person while trust is built. And then the doing is about doing professional practice in a way that combines hands-on and hands-off approaches. It's important, seeking a tiny element of leeway or room for agreement, doing things with them. So it's all about relationship-based practice, your best person-centered practice. It's all about creating small, achievable goals to avoid failure, to positively reinforce those small, achievable goals. Successes are built upon, failures not so easy to achieve. Don't set people up to fail. SMART goals can be useful. That is setting goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. Doing it with them, chunking it up into manageable steps. So we're not down the bottom of the ladder and can't even reach up to the first rung. You know, we've got through some of those small achievable goals and got the positive reinforcement from that and the positive emotions from that. And that ties in with all the work we did earlier, thinking about the cognitive behavioural approach, etc. So it's all about a relational approach. It's about building rapport. It's about refusing to be shocked, talking through the person's interests, their history, hearing their story. Be honest whilst being non-judgmental. Express concern. Separate the person from the behaviour though. I'm really worried because it's -3 outside and I can see you've got no heating on and summer clothes on. So you're being honest. I'm really worried because I can't see any food in the fridge and I can see you haven't taken your medication for a few days. I'm really worried because smoking with this much paper around could cause a fire and you can't get to the door. So show concern, show interest over time, take things at their pace if you can, unless there's an immediate risk. Make clear to them what is going to happen and when. So I will need to come back. I'm going to come back on. I'm going to bring somebody from fire services so that we can do da 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 da. So stick to the plan, explain it to them. Be clear in your communication. Think about, is there anything that could that is linked to the hoarding that could motivate them? So do they hate waste? Could they be linked to recycling initiatives in their area, for example? So start small, keep it practical at the start to build trust. Barter, you know, if I can replace your cooker, would you go see the doctor about those injuries, about those pressure sores? Find something early on you can agree on, you can build on that later. Who do they trust? Is there somebody they trust that you could utilize to help you get that initial engagement? And as I say, straight talking is really useful, particularly about consequences. So I'm really worried about your tenancy because I'm aware that in your tenancy agreement, it says this. So straight talking and talking about consequences. Possible interventions. Here's a couple of lists of them. You'll be aware of a lot of them. You would have used some of them. Always weigh up the likely benefits and the likely drawbacks to any of these sorts of interventions. Keep the person at the centre. The impact of them for each approach must be thought about and your rationale recorded as to why you've gone down a particular route, you've utilised a particular approach. You must be able to show that you thought it was in their best interests, that you were adhering to the law. It can't just be about getting a result for your organisation, a quick fix so you can shut the case. A quick fix rarely works. issues, as we've seen, are deep rooted. In order to avoid a revolving door situation, you need to front load your time and your energy. It's all about relationship-based practice, building trust. And if you do that, you'll get people saying these sorts of statements. We're not here to condemn you, we're here to help you. I couldn't believe it. I thought I was going to get an enormous bollocking. So people do think they're going to be told off. They do think people are going to judge them. This person, they weren't helping, they were just leaving it for me to do. Whereas when this person came, they were hands-on. Let's do it together. Shall we start cleaning up now? He's been human. That's the word I can use. He's been human. So that he they're referring to, obviously delving into their ability to empathize, think, feel, do, exercise. She got it into my head that I'm important. I'm on this earth for a reason. Assessing factors then. These are the things that we need to consider when we're assessing. Of course, also utilising the stuff we've already talked about earlier. So thinking about the history, the nature of the self-neglect and all the hoarding, their views around it. We need to think about fire, hygiene and structural safety issues. Are exits blocked? Is the bathroom usable? Is there a fire risk? You know, where are the sources of heat in the property? Or are they obstructed? Consider joint assessing with fire and rescue services, with environmental health services, with a housing officer. Often they have more powers of entry than other professionals. Think about strengths and protective factors. What's going well? What are they managing to do? You know, have they maintained relationships with neighbours? They've maintained their tenancy. Is there an area that is quite tidy? You know, what are they managing to do? So thinking about strengths-based perspective as well. Always thinking about mental capacity, but making it decision specific, not just generic, they do or they don't, thinking about the decisions. And I'm going to bring up another tool now, which is the clutter rating scale. So just bear with me a moment while I get this up. Here we go, clutter rating scale. So there's a link to it on the PowerPoint, and there is a link to it at the end of the PowerPoint as well. Really useful tool. Some of you would have used this with people. There's a little bit of blurb on the front page, and then there's lots of pictures. Sorry about these being so small, but what you can see is 3 rooms there being risk assessed from green to red through amber, and it explains what those are. And this is a really, really useful tool to use with somebody. It makes things very objective. It's a national model that's utilised. So rather than comparing somebody's bedroom with your own bedroom at home that might be incredibly tidy, or what you think a bedroom should look like, because you've been watching, you know, people when they're selling their house on telly and everything's decluttered, they've actually got a scale here going from 1 where it's perfectly fine up to number 9 when actually it's a fire risk and we need to get a referral in to safeguarding services. It's really useful to use something like this with a person. So if you're rating it as a number 9, for example, or anywhere in the red, and they're rating it somewhere down in the green, there's a bedroom there, a living room and a kitchen, it gives you a bit of understanding of, in terms of their insight. You know, do they not have a lot of insight because they're rating it as a number 1, whereas looking at the same room and the same picture, you're rating it as a number 6, where you need to do some preventative work to bring it down into the green and prevent it going up to the red. So it's a really useful tool to help you assess the situation, but also, their insight into the situation. So here we go. There's the clutter rating scale link. I wanted to do a reminder on mental capacity. So it's not mental capacity training today. We're just going to touch on it briefly. I've mentioned it a couple of times, which is why I wanted to make a couple of points. Mental capacity assessment is, as I say, decision and time specific. Assessment shouldn't simply be verbal either, tell me. It should move to show me at times as well. For example, if you think the person may have an acquired brain injury, which can be seen as a hidden disability, which can affect cognitive functioning. Remember I talked about functioning earlier. Remember that can affect their executive functioning. So for example, the person might be able to tell you how they're going to manage that fire risk, or take their medication, or keep their skin clean, or turn the heating on when it gets really cold, but they cannot actually enact that. They cannot execute the intent. And if that's the case, we need to move beyond the tell me to a bit of show me in that assessment of capacity. Also, some people have fluctuating capacity, and the Bristol's policy says the following about that. That's particularly common in situations of self-neglect. Fluctuating capacity might occur because of their lifestyle or behaviour, might lead to unwise decision making, declining treatment, prioritising a substance over a health need. Someone might be unduly influenced and controlled by somebody. They might be experiencing high levels of distress and making unwise decisions. So somebody, for example, with particular unstable personality disorder, or maybe they've got a urinary tract infection, or even constipation can affect capacity around specific decisions. So fluctuation can take place over days, weeks, over the course of a day. We should be thinking about assessing capacity when someone's at their highest level of functioning. And the key question in these situations is whether the decision can wait until the adult has received treatment for an infection, like a urinary tract infection. It might be necessary in emergency situations to proceed in a person's best interest. For people who've got ongoing fluctuating capacity, the approach taken will depend on the cycle of that fluctuation in terms of its length and its severity. And it's necessary, therefore, to review capacity assessments over a period of time and not just deal one-off and then make decisions or take action or not around that one-off situation. And sometimes we need to take legal advice around people who appear to have capacity but are making very, very unwise, life-threatening decisions. We need to think about a whole system approach to self-neglect. So this chap, Michael Preston Shute, he likes diagrams that look a bit like an onion, and they're really useful for us, this onion diagram, because it looks at systems and how they interplay between these layers. The person's at the centre, of course, and the relationship with that person is so important for us to take that person-centred approach to build that trust and a context for this behaviour and a history. The worker then needs that time and skills to develop that professional relationship, and here they're bringing in and are supported by legal literacy. So some of the things we looked at around the law, ethical literacy. So remember that diagram that had the two arrows, the extreme responses, differing pressures, might be around organisational processes, infrastructures, etc. So somebody can advocate and maintain contact, avoid case closure, assess and review risk and capacity in an ongoing way, understanding when to utilise these powers of other agencies around, say, for example, environmental health issues, health and safety, safeguarding, the duty of care. And it's also about how the worker receives their support around things like supervision and managerial oversight. So learning also from safeguarding adult reviews that comes into the layer around the very edge, and governmental guidance, keeping up to date on policy, procedure, case law, training, which is why the self-neglect policy has been recently reviewed, because that's good practice. A couple of other ways of working, recording. So tips around recording. It's really important to record assessment, to record decision making and intervention, to demonstrate that a proper process has been followed and that practitioners and managers have acted reasonably and proportionately. There should be an audit trail of what options were considered and why certain actions were or were not taken. So a rationale is really important. Record the situation, what you've considered, who you've collaborated with, for example, within the systems on the previous slide. What decisions have been reached and by whom? What knowledge base are you referring to? Which bits of the law, which model, what good practice guidance, which bit of policy? and put those activity notes into a framework of considerations and demonstrate why you've chosen a particular course of action. So, for example, if you do have to instruct a deep clean, which you know will re-traumatize the person who's hoarding, you can demonstrate that you actually considered the positives and negatives of that approach, and other approaches were tried and didn't work, and therefore this approach is needed at this time, and how you supported the person through that deep clean. So that's, as I say, about explaining your rationale so that decisions and actions are legally defensible. And the case shouldn't be closed simply because the person refuses an assessment or to accept a plan to minimise the risks associated with their behaviour. We need to be thinking about, professional curiosity. We need to think about leaving doors open for people, planting seeds so that they know where to come or how to re-refer themselves if they change their mind. We need to think about escalating our concerns. We need to think about multi-agency planning or multi-agency agreement to close. So utilising the policy wherever someone sits on the spectrum of self-neglect and or hoarding, and recording around that. Other resources then. One massive resource is you. And I don't hear enough people showing off, peacocking their best practice. I hear a lot about good practice when I push for it and ask questions about it when I'm doing safeguarding adult reviews or training. But you are a resource. We learn from our good practice. We learn when we get things right as much as from when things didn't go so well. So as well as reading those safeguarding adult reviews, for example, pass on your good practice, pass on any tips you've got on what might work, any information, any resources, how you use that clutter rating scale, for example. It's really, really important for you to think about how you share good practice, how your organisation does. More resources. So the Bristol policy is really, really useful. It's full of information and practical tools to help with working with people who are self-neglecting and hoarding at whatever level that might be. As I say, it's got multi-agency assessments of needs and proformas that you can use for that. It's got a multi-agency risk assessment checklist that you can go through. It talks to you about and gives you a pro forma around conducting multi-agency meetings when something isn't going into safeguarding, but there's still an issue, for example. It talks about what should be covered, when to escalate, legal interventions. It's got the links to things like the clutter rating scale that I went through with you, and much, much more. I really recommend you read it, especially if you're working with someone who is self-neglecting or hoarding. There's the Making Space project in Bristol. There's research that this chap, Dr. James Gregory, who works at the University of Bath, undertakes regularly. So there's some links to his research there around hoarding disorder, for example. Sometimes he does therapeutic work as well. There's the clutter rating scale. There's also the link to the Avon Fire and Rescue Service. They're brilliant to go out with when you're assessing risk around fire, for example, and they can put lots of things in place, fire retardant blankets for those people that are smoking in bed next to their hoard, all sorts of different things. And then some national organisations I've put for you there as well. So as we finish, feel free to pop any questions in the chat function, and I'll deal with that once we stop recording and do my best to answer. As I say, there's no experts around this. It's very, very complex as an area. Sometimes there isn't a right or wrong answer. But as we finish, think about what you're going to do next. What will you do as a result of this training? How are you going to transfer your knowledge? You might be feeling really validated around your knowledge base. How are you going to keep it fresh? How are you going to transfer some new stuff you might have learned today? So we've covered a fair bit of ground, and I think this quote by Maya Angelou really sums up and fits nicely with the exercise we did around empathizing and the think, feel, do exercise. So I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So that's it for today. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you for the IT people. I'm going to stop the share. We'll stop the recording and move on to any questions in the chat function. Thank you very much.